You know what this video is all about? That was the Eureka Oath behind us. We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other and fight to defend our rights and liberties. This presentation is basically about the Eureka Rebellion to mark the 170th anniversary of the rebellion and what it means for us. That's right, you and me, 170 years later. Now, the Eureka Rebellion has been taken up, and the symbols of the Eureka Rebellion, the flag, have been taken up by a motley crew of people who basically have no understanding of what the events were all about, how they developed, why they developed, and it doesn't matter who uses the symbols, whether it's a business trying to promote its business using the Eureka flag, or a white supremacist group using the Eureka flag. Facts are facts. In an era where facts seem to be disposable extras, it's important that we actually look at the Eureka story and reclaim the radical spirit of the Eureka Rebellion. And I'll mention that again. Reclaim the radical spirit of the Eureka Rebellion. How did it all begin? How did it come about? Why do we still celebrate and commemorate the event 170 years later that occurred in Ballarat on the 3rd of December 1854? Did the Eureka Rebellion begin and end on the 3rd of December 1854? Or did it begin many years earlier? And it's still an ongoing proposition. Let's start at the beginning, the very beginning. Over 60,000 years ago, the area which is known as Victoria was colonised by people who for 2,000 generations had a continuing association with the land, the animals, the birds, the water, the oceans. And for 60,000 years, they conducted their affairs based on language groups, different areas, different creation stories. All this changed in 1788. When the first group of convicts and soldiers arrived at Botany Bay to set up a penal colony to try to empty the overfull prisons in England, especially after the loss of the American colonies in the American Civil War in 1776. So what does the landing at Botany Bay have to do with what happened at Eureka? Well, it's simple. When these new men and women arrived, they brought with them diseases which were unknown to the local inhabitants, things like diphtheria, smallpox, influenza, typhoid, typhus, and the list goes on and on. Well, no, the first settlement occurred at Port Jackson. Within 5 to 10 years, almost every person on the continent of Australia suffered the consequences of that early colonisation process due to disease. When human hovel crossed Victoria looking for grasslands for the ever-expanding sheep industry, they came across local Aboriginal people in Victoria who had smallpox scars on their faces, and areas which had been abandoned because of the deaths that occurred as a result of the introduction of these diseases which local people had no resistance to. So by the time the 3 Enterprise, a ship bought and piloted by illegal settlers who arrived in Melbourne in 1835, over 70% of the original inhabitants had been killed through the introduction of disease and through the atrocities committed by sealers who had been camped on Victoria's shores since 1803. So when the colonisers arrived in Victoria, they wanted one thing: land. That's why the ship was called the Three Enterprise. They wanted land. And why did they want land? They wanted land in order to supply the hellholes, the industrial revolutionary factories which had sprung up of the industrial age. They needed wool for their spinning machines. They needed this raw product to create goods which could be exported around the world for a profit. So, when the original settlers arrived, began an orgy, that's right, of theft and death, as the original inhabitants, through the sword, through the gun, through disease, were swept off the land because sheep needed grass. And the irony was that many of the grasslands which had been discovered by human novel in Victoria had been created because of the farming practices or the agricultural practices that Aboriginal people had conducted in Victoria for generations. At the same time, the sheep also that were brought across needed water, they needed food apart from the grasslands. And that fresh water became a battleground, because without fresh water there is no life. And one of the staple products of one of the staple food sources of Aboriginal people in Victoria was murnion, a yam-like, potato-like, starchy product which grew underground. When the sheep came, they pulled the murnion out by the roots. So within 10 years of the colonisation process beginning, 700 squatters owned, in inverted commas, Victoria. From a thriving population of over 100,000 before colonisation, the Aboriginal population within 15 years had been reduced to less than 2,000. Many of them forced onto reserves. And the irony was that Robinson, the very man who was responsible for collecting the survivors of the 30-year war the local Aboriginal people in Tasmania conducted against the British colonisers, who was able to migrate the remnants, 383 people, to Flinders Island, and in the process, the Governor of Tasmania said that the land values had doubled in the space of a year. Of those 353 people, 83 were left and 17 accompanied Robinson to Melbourne to civilise the Victorian blacks. I could talk about the resistance, because this is not the format for that. I've spoken about that before in the Tanaminua Mulbohina commemoration video, which is on this particular YouTube channel. Now, Victoria was actually part of New South Wales. It was part of New South Wales. It achieved independence and became an independent colony as far as the British authorities were concerned from New South Wales in 1851. Although gold had been discovered in the Dandenong Ranges outside Melbourne, the discovery was hushed up. Because when the colony achieved its independence, its charter, in 1851, apart from the governor, which initially was Latrobe and then Hotham, the sole ruling mechanism was the Legislative Council. And the Legislative Council was not elected on universal suffrage. A significant proportion was appointed by the government, and the rest of the legislative councillors represented the squatters. Now, the squatters weren't poor men and women who'd gone out and claimed land. The squatters, to a significant degree, were the sons of the English aristocracy who sent their wayward sons or their fourth in line to succession with a bundle of cash to Australia to find their fortune. That fortune meant squatting land without paying for it and using the labour of ticket of leave convicts. That's men and women who'd served their sentence but were still not able to return to England. So they had free land, cashed up, and cheap labour. Anybody could make a profit. In 1851, when gold was first discovered, as I said before, the Legislative Council went into meltdown because the business plan they had removed the First Nations people, who they described as vermin, from the land, use ticket of leave men and women, convicts, as cheap labour, bring in sheep, place them on this land that was squatted, and watch the money roll in. Now, this business plan was in jeopardy with the discovery of gold, because there were gold rushes around the world. Because let's not forget that miners, finding gold in significant quantities to be rich for the rest of your life, is equivalent to winning First Division in a Tats Lotto ticket. Many people play Tats Lotto, very few win First Division, and that's the whole point. But the fact is that people who find themselves in desperate situations, the people who are looking for a new life, the people who are fleeing from failed revolutions which swept Europe in 1848, the people involved in the Chartist movement in England, were all looking for a new life. And the lure of gold promised them the possibility of a new life, free of the strictures of the old ways, free of the class divisions, free of the hatred, free of poverty, freedom of equality. So what happened over the next few years is that tens of thousands, up to 250,000 people, flocked into the Victorian goldfields, which at one time were producing more wealth than any part of the world, the most wealthy part of the British Empire. So what did the legislative councillors do? Did they pass legislation to tax the gold that came out of the earth? Or did they introduce a different form of taxation? They decided to introduce a mining licence for each miner. That's right, a mining licence. for a few metres of earth, square metres of earth, miners paid a significant sum of money, up to £2 a month, for the right to dig that ground, trying to find their fortune, to free themselves from the inequalities of the past. And why did they introduce mining licences and not taxation on the gold that came out of the ground? For one very good reason. They were shit scared. They were frightened that they would lose their cheap labour. And without cheap labour, you could not make those extraordinary profits from sheep and wool, which they were making in the late 1840s and the early 1850s in Victoria. So the whole purpose of the legislation was to try to stop people going to the goldfields. Obviously, faced with decades of toil, living in bark huts on rations and maybe a little bit extra cash, and the possibility of finding gold and changing your life radically in a short period of time, large sections of Victorians flocked to the goldfields. Not only did they flock to the goldfields, at one stage there were so few police left in Victoria, and let's not forget the Victoria Police were formed in 1853, that Marines from ships in the harbour, British ships in the harbour, had to come to the Treasury to guard the Treasury, to guard the gold that had been eked out of the earth. So this is the situation in 1854. You have over 250,000 people who've come to find their fortunes. About 50,000 of them who had been living in Victoria, and the other 200,000 from all corners of the world. All corners of the world. And that's an important thing to remember. They came from all corners of the world. So what type of people came to find their fortune? Romantics, failed revolutionaries, people eking out a living, Irish men and women facing starvation in Ireland, freed slaves from the British colonies, as well as freed slaves from North America, people from every country on the European field, as well as Chinese from southern China. They're all here with the same purpose, trying to ensure they had a future that they could finance, which had no fear of, there was no fear of poverty, no fear of oppression, equality. So here we have riots occurring against the licence fee because 98% of miners didn't strike it rich. The great majority, as we see for Tats Lotto tickets, didn't find any gold. A few found a few specks, and only a small minority found significant amounts of gold. They couldn't afford a mining licence. There was rebellion on the goldfields. This was not aided by the fact that we had a corrupt Victoria Police Force who were underpaid by the state, who augmented their pay by obtaining a percentage of the fines, which were about £5, which were levied on miners who were not able to produce their licence when asked to produce their licence. The rebellion wasn't just in Ballarat. There was a Red Ribbon campaign in Bendigo. There were the Rushworth riots in 1853. There were instances of rebellion at Castlemaine, Clunes. Wherever there was gold, there were mass meetings and people fighting against the mining licence. But things came to a head in Ballarat in 1854. And on the 11th of November 1854, the Ballarat Reform League was formed. And those of you who are familiar with the 11th of November, the importance of the 11th of November in Australian history, the 11th of November 1854 was the date the Ballarat Reform League was formed. The 11th of November 1880 was the date Ned Kelly was hung. The 11th of November 1980 was the end of the Great War, the war to end all wars, the war fought by workers at either end of a bayonet for the glory of God, King and country. And on the 11th of November 1975, the Whitlam Labor government, the most reformist government since Federation, was ousted by the Governor-General. So the 11th of November is an important day. Let's not forget that. So on the 11th of November 1854, the Ballarat Reform League was formed. And it was formed in Ballarat to give cohesion to a growing number of people who were unhappy with the gold licence, the way it was collected, and the corruption of the Victoria Police Force and the Victorian legal system, which was riddled with corrupt officers, corrupt magistrates. Now, the British authorities, having learnt their lesson with the revolts in Upper and Lower Canada 10 years previously, didn't want to see a rebellion break out in Victoria, their richest colony in the British Empire at that particular point in time, and they appointed a naval disciplinarian, Governor Hotham, as the governor of Victoria. Latrobe was given his marching orders, retired, and Hotham took over. Now, Hotham was used to people obeying his orders, being a naval officer most of his life. He had little time for democratic means. He had little time for negotiation. Although he went to Ballarat, where he was welcomed because people believed he may get rid of the mining licence, he never acted in any way to change the status quo. That was not in his nature. His ability to deal with these situations was he was not able to deal with any type of dissension. So what did the Ballarat Reform League stand for? It stood for much more than the abolition of the gold licence. It stood for universal male suffrage, although the Chartists, when they were initially formed in the 1830s in England, were talking about both male and female suffrage. It talked about one-year parliaments to prevent corruption in the parliamentary system. It talked about many of the aims of the British Chartists as well as new aims. These were their demands. Things got out of hand when James Scobie, a miner who'd been drinking at Bentley's Hotel, was assaulted and thrown out and died outside Bentley's Hotel. The next few days, the miners burnt down Bentley's Hotel. Things got out of hand when the government sent more and more troops into Ballarat to quieten the disquiet. But what was fascinating, history is replete with rebellions, failed rebellions, successful rebellions, rebellions which lead to democratic change, rebellions which lead to dictatorships. So what was different about this rebellion? What was different about this rebellion was, one, that in Ballarat, a tent city of 25,000 people, there were 4 independent newspapers who supported the miners, who helped to organise the mass meetings. 2, this was a movement which was based on direct democratic principles. That's right, direct democratic principles. All decisions were made at mass meetings which were called by the Ballarat Reform League. That's right, the Ballarat Reform League. call these mass meetings. There were discussions. There were no PAs, no electricity. Discussions amongst 20,000, 15,000, which would turn up at these meetings. Delegates would be appointed and sent to Melbourne to negotiate with Governor Hotham for universal male suffrage, for yearly parliaments, for reform of the Victoria Police, for the abolition of the gold licence. And the list went on and on and on. Each time the delegates would return back to Ballarat. Each time they spoke about their failed negotiations with Governor Hotham and his team. So the temperature increased in Ballarat. It reached a boiling point. But at any time, the government and the Legislative Council could have taken the heat out of the rebellion by abolishing gold licences and introducing taxes on the gold that was removed from the earth at any time. But they decided to continue their policies of individual licences for the individual miners because they needed cheap labour to look after their sheep, to send wool to the satanic mills in England, which were using 4- and 5-year-olds as cheap labour, disposable labour. So, if you live in a tent city, you get out of your tent and you look around and all you see is other tents. Now in this tent city in Ballarat, there were shops, there were bakeries, newspaper offices, theatre, you name it. And you could tell where everything was because everything had a flag. And if you saw a flag with bread on it, you knew that was the baker and that's the direction you would head into. So the Ballarat Reform League needed a symbol. They needed a symbol to replace the butcher's apron, the flag of Great Britain. They needed a symbol which talked about their rights, their liberties. And the story goes that while the Ballarat Reform League one night was discussing the need for a symbol, one of the members went out to relieve himself. And when he looked up, he saw the Southern Cross. And he raced in and he said, "I have it, the Southern Cross." So why the Southern Cross? Remember, this is a tent city. At the end of a hard day's digging, there's no electricity, no radio, no television, no TikTok, no Google, no Facebook, possibly a newspaper, read, possibly. You look up in the sky and what do you see before you go to bed? You see the Southern Cross. And the Southern Cross is the only, apart from the Morning Star, which is the symbol of the West Papua independence movement, it is the only constellation that is not seen in the Northern Hemisphere. So to them, the Southern Cross was a symbol of the new life they would pursue in this new country. It was a symbol of their dreams and aspirations. And the blue and white of the Southern Cross became their rallying cry. Now the Southern Cross had to be, there was a large monster meeting on the 29th of November, 4 days before the Eureka Rebellion. The Southern Cross had to be fashioned in a hurry. And 4 women, including Mrs. Withers, or 3 women, were given the job of coming up with a large flag which could be seen on this 3-storey flagpole, which had been created out of a tree that had been cut down at Bakery Hill, the centre for the next monster meeting on the 29th of November. And short of time, they created the flag behind us, which many people are familiar with, the Southern Cross. It's an 8-pointed star. And if you've got the time to go to the Ballarat Centre, Eureka Centre in Ballarat, they have what's left of the original flag undercover, which you can look at. It's an 8-pointed star because it's very easy to make an 8-pointed star. If you're in a rush, you just fold the cloth. Much of the Southern Cross is made out of women's undercoats. Not undercoats, underwear. Because women in those days wore 5, 6, 7 different layers of petticoats. And the easiest way to come up with material to make a flag of that size was to use that underwear. We'll sew it overnight. And the next morning it was hoisted above the crowd. The largest monster meeting that had been seen in Ballarat at Bakery Hill. Over 20,000 people arrived out of a population of 25,000. And I heard once again from their delegates that Governor Hotham had rejected every one of their demands, and had sent more troops to the goldfields, more police to maintain order, more arrests. At the end of the meeting, a breakaway group of about 500 crowded around the Southern Cross. And Peter Laylaw, who was closely associated with one of the important families involved in the 1848 Irish Rebellion, the Young Ireland Rebellion, Peter Laylaw jumped on a stump, and the miners recited the following oath, an extraordinary oath, considering it's 1854. And the oath says, we, not white people, black people, yellow people, men, women, we, everybody involved in that movement, everybody there, irrespective of religion, colour, job description, race, we swear by the Southern Cross. As I said before, the Southern Cross is what they identified as the symbol of a new life free of the divisions and the hatreds of the old life. We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other. They understood the one important thing in any radical, reformist, revolutionary movement is mutual aid, solidarity. We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other. And more importantly, and fight to defend our rights and liberties. They believed they were born with inalienable human rights and liberties which no government, no business, no police officer, no soldier could take away from them. We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other and fight to defend our rights and liberties. An extraordinary oath. And after that oath was sworn at Bakery Hill, they went down to the Eureka diggings and set up the Eureka Stockade, where a blacksmith at the centre of the stockade made pikes, a classical weapon which was used by English, Irish, Scottish and other people around the world against the mounted troops of the British Armed Forces. Pikes which cut the reins of a horse at distance, which allowed the rebels to, unmount the soldier. At the same time, the Eureka flag was flown at the centre of the camp. On that Saturday, the 2nd of December, over 2,000 people drilled with their arms in the stockade. Over 2,000. This was in many regards direct democracy in action. the different platoons or groups, whatever you like to call them, elected their captain. Raphael Carboni from Umbria in Italy was elected the captain of the non-English speaking brigade. That's right, the non-English speaking brigade at the Eureka Rebellion. And on the morning of the 3rd of December, there were only 104 miners left in the stockade. Nobody believed that the British authorities would attack them on God's Day, Sunday. How wrong they were. How wrong they were. When it comes to money, when it comes to power, no colonising force respects anything, let alone a belief in a deity. So in the early hours of the 3rd of December 1854, 104 poorly armed miners were in the stockade site. Alcohol had appeared that night. Many of them had drank lots of that alcohol and weren't in a fit state to fight back. 240 British soldiers from the 12th and the 40th Regiment, plus over 96 Victorian mounted police, attacked the camp at dawn. What happened over the next half a dozen hours is a travesty. It's about a war crime that's been committed on this land which has never been acknowledged. Although the radical spirit of the Eureka Rebellion celebrations group has attempted on numerous occasions to get an apology for what happened on that night. Within 20 minutes, the stockade had been overrun. The British troops were relatively disciplined. They pulled down the Eureka flag from the flagpole and stamped it into the ground. The Victoria Police, a motley crew, began 3 hours of terror, where they galloped up to 5 kilometres from the stockade site, burning tents, gunning down miners and their supporters, stealing gold. This was a police riot. This was a massacre, which, although it was acknowledged in the Royal Commission in 1855, nobody ever stood trial for any atrocity committed by the Victoria Police in 1855, unless in 1854. Now, an important part, think about it. It's 4:35 a.m. The sun is bursting forth, and in the Eureka Stockade there are men full of musket wounds. Edward Fonan, the lemonade man who the pikeman's dog belonged to, had 13 musket balls in his body. See, what happened during the battle is 30 of the miners in the encampment, a significant proportion Irish, held up their pikes as the troops came rushing down on them, galloped down on them. And they did this in a vain attempt to save the other people in the stockade, give them time to run away into the crowd. And of those 30, 15 died on the spot, riddled with musket balls. None had guns, they just had pikes. They stood there against the invading force. They showed a great deal of bravery, heroism, which is hardly ever acknowledged. To stand there, not run, when confronted with over 300, many on horseback galloping towards you, is an extraordinary feat. So at the end of the battle, there are men dying. Women jump over the fence, the stockade fence. It's not a fence, it's just wagons. They jump over and lie themselves over the bodies of men who've been shot, who were wounded, who may have been even dying, in order to stop the soldiers from bayoneting them to death. There's smoke, there's fire, there's screaming. It's an extraordinary scene. Governor Hotham issues a state of emergency. I think it's General Nicklin, I could be wrong here, is given command of 800 troops, and these 800 troops march to Ballarat to restore order. They march to Ballarat to restore order. Over 50 died on that night, either on the night or of their wounds in the next few weeks. Many, like Peter Laylaw, who had his arm amputated a few days after because he had a gunshot wound to his arm, were spirited away to Geelong and other places in drays, because the Eureka miners had widespread support around the state. And the next day there were mass meetings. A mass meeting in Melbourne Town Hall, which was called by the Mayor to congratulate the government on what they had done, was taken over by the people at the mass meeting, and the Mayor was ejected from the mass meeting and a new chairperson was elected, which passed resolutions which supported the miners. And in Warrnambool, Castlemaine, Clunes, Bendigo, wherever there was a settlement, there were demonstrations. And these demonstrations were held to show their support for the miners. Hotham, to his horror, realised that although 113 had been arrested, that all his troops, all his police were in Ballarat. An open rebellion could have occurred at any moment. Fearing the consequences of open rebellion, fearing the consequences of what happened in the rebellions in Upper and Lower Canada a decade earlier, Hotham sues for peace. But he still wants his pound of flesh. He still wants to show people that he is in charge. So what happens over the next 6 months is an extraordinary situation. Of the 113 that were arrested, 13 are tried for high treason. And high treason is the most heinous crime in the British colonisers' mind. It's treason against the monarch. It's treason against the flag. They flew a rebel flag. They flew the Southern Cross. It is seen as a heinous crime. And even in 1854, the punishment for high treason was hanging, drawing and quartering. And if you're not sure what that means, I'll go through it with you. If you're squeamish, don't listen to the next minute or two. First of all, the person is hung, strangled to an inch of their life. Then they're laid on a table. Then the executioner produces a knife and cuts open the abdomen from the zippy sternum right down to the symphysis pubis. He then raises the intestines in the air, because remember, these were public executions. These were seen as examples. These were examples. These were public executions. Public executions. And not anybody can see a public execution, but everybody remembers the smells, the sounds. The intestines were lifted up and then burnt. And the smell, once smelt, never forgotten, wafted over the crowd. And then, if you were lucky, the executioner will pull out your heart. But if you're a leader, then you were quartered. A horse was placed on each limb, and on a command, they pulled your limbs off. That's what's hanging, trawling, and quartering. So the 13 men who were tried for high treason faced this punishment. This is the punishment they faced. So the authorities thought, let's put up somebody who everybody's going to think is guilty. Now, John Joseph was a freed slave from New York. He'd come from New York to Ballarat to find his fortune. Now, John Joseph was the only one of the Americans involved in the rebellion who was arrested. All the other Americans were not arrested because of a pact which was made between the US consul in Victoria and the Victorian governor. So although many had commands, like McGill, second in command of the Eureka Rebellion, they were never arrested or prosecuted. But John Joseph, because he was a black man, he was arrested. And everybody knew that he fired the shot which wounded Captain Wise at the beginning of the cavalry charge. And Captain Wise was the deputy commander of the British forces, and he died of his wounds a fortnight later. Everybody knew. He was tried for high treason, and he was found within 30 minutes not guilty. Not guilty. He was cheered, and cheered through the streets of Melbourne by a crowd of over 25,000, many who had brought arms just in case he was convicted. Over the next 6 months, every one of the people involved in the rebellion was freed, found not guilty by a jury of their peers. John Sorrison, a Jew. A black man from Kingston, another freed slave from Kingston, Jamaica. One native-born Australian from Sydney, I think his name was BT. So at the end of rebellion, at the end of the 6 months, Hotham was a sick man. The government was teetering. It had no option but to accept all the demands of the Ballarat Reform League. And although the Legislative Council attempted to stymie any possibility of change, the beginning and the end for the stockocracy in Victoria began in 1855, when the very men who were the leaders of this rebellion, people like Laylaw, people like Humphrey, within 12 months were elected to the Victorian Parliament. At the same time, more radical elements in the Victorian Parliament and outside the Victorian Parliament set up an alternative parliament at the site of the Southern Markets, which was the old site of the Southern Cross Hotel, which is now a government building in Exhibition Street. And for the next 10 years, the Victorian Parliament and the alternative parliament crossed swords over land reform, over the ability of people to acquire land, because as the gold petered out, people wanted to create a new life for themselves. Not all could live in the cities. Many needed land, and they acquired land. And slowly but surely over decades, the monopoly on land that the squatters had in Victoria outside the towns and the cities began to collapse. Not completely, but slowly. Universal male suffrage was introduced. It wasn't until 1908 that female suffrage was introduced in Victoria, although women had acquired the vote federally in 1902 because their sisters in South Australia acquired the vote before Federation. Under the Constitution, any right enjoyed by any Australian in any state could be enjoyed by anybody else, but it wasn't until 1908 that Victorian women had the right to vote in Victorian elections. So this was an extraordinary moment. Extraordinary moments. How can we sum this up? What are the essential criteria? What are the important things about the Eureka Rebellion? The first one was internationalism. Internationalism. Now those white supremacists out there who think the Eureka flag is their flag need to think again and learn their history. Because the men and women who made up the rebels came from all corners of the planet, of all races, of all religions, of all colours, of all cultures, of all nationalities. It was an international revolt against tyranny. They understood it's not the colour of the foot that's on your throat that's the problem. The problem is the person whose foot is on your throat. They understood that. They understood they had a common enemy. So internationalism is one of the most important features of the Eureka Rebellion. The second one is solidarity. They worked together. They understood that the only way that a reform, revolution, radical change is possible is by working together. If you don't work together, your chances of overcoming the state and the authorities or even the business sector, the corporate sector, is negligible, almost impossible. It's people working together that make the difference. Internationalism, solidarity, direct democracy. Now, although they were fighting for a parliamentary democracy, the irony is they were involved in one of the most important democratic traditions since time immemorial. When people came together, made decisions about specific issues, and then elected or appointed delegates to carry out those instructions of the mass meeting. And then those delegates reported back to the mass meeting at the end of that process. This was direct democracy, something we sorely needed in 2025 and 2024 and 2025. Sorely needed as we approach the end of 2024, where parliamentary democracy has been usurped by that small section that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, where even if reformist elements are elected to Parliament, we see the same old 1% maintaining control. And direct democracy is not about electing a representative to make decisions for you for the next 3 to 4 years you can do nothing about, but it's about making decisions directly, then appointing or electing people to carry out those decisions. So direct democracy. The mass meeting, the monster meetings, the delegations that went to Melbourne to discuss with Hotham and his crew were as essential to the Eureka Rebellion. And last but not least was direct action, taking up arms to defend what they believed were their inalienable rights and liberties. So the four cornerstones of the Eureka Rebellion are internationalism, solidarity, direct democracy, direct action, irrespective of what people say. They may call it a revolt by small business people. They may call it a revolt about taxation. No taxation about representation. They may call it a revolt, by the white supremacists. That's not the issue. The issue is, if you look at the nuts and bolts of the Eureka Rebellion, it's about internationalism. It's about solidarity. It's about direct democracy and direct action. So why is it so important 170 years later? Why is Eureka still contested history? Why are there so many people who clutch the Eureka flag to their bosom, believing things that have nothing whatsoever to do with the Eureka Rebellion? Why? Well, the Eureka Rebellion was an example of what people can do when they band together and they face authoritarianism in all its forms. Whether it's an authoritarianism born of colonialism, whether it's an authoritarianism born of a representative democracy which has been usurped by the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, whether it's an authoritarianism based on religion or gender, culture, sexual orientation. It's people coming together and facing those demons together, which ensures that change occurs. And in the coming year, in 2025, we are faced with huge issues, what I describe as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, the biblical apocalypse. Growing population, limited resources, growing greenhouse emissions, creating a climate emergency. And last but not least, a world economy which is dominated by a private investment for private profit mantra, where profit, irrespective of the human, social, and environmental costs, is the single most important arbitrator in every human relationship. So we are faced with insoluble problems which as individuals we will never be able to solve, address, let alone solve. We need to understand the issues that face us. We need to understand the types of governments, the types of so-called democracies we have are not fit for purpose. Not fit for purpose, not able to resolve these issues. We need to understand that radical egalitarian change is cooperative change is essential. And that's why the Eureka Rebellion is so important 170 years later. That's why we continue to celebrate the Eureka Rebellion, irrespective of what other people do on the day. Could you imagine the French not celebrating Bastille Day? Could you imagine the North Americans not celebrating Independence Day? But in Australia, 170 years later, although men and possibly a few women lost their lives on that fateful day or died of their wounds a few weeks later, the fact is that we have forgotten what Eureka is about. We don't celebrate Eureka. We don't commemorate the dead. We don't go to the old Ballarat cemetery and pay our respects at the mass grave. Fewer and fewer people understand what the 3rd of December is. The tragedy in Ballarat, of all places, that is on the 3rd of December, the Eureka flag is not flown on the main flagpole on the Ballarat City Hall, and never in the 170-year history, even during the 150th anniversary celebration, was the Eureka flag flown on the main flagpole at Ballarat Town Hall. And if you find yourself in Ballarat on the 3rd of December, there is a dearth of Eureka flags. There is a minimal number of activities. And in years that don't end with a 5 or a 0 as far as the celebrations are concerned, there is hardly anything. And that's why the radical spirit of the Eureka Rebellion group, irrespective of harassment by police in the past and the Ballarat City Council currently, have teamed up with Ballarat Trades Hall to ensure that this day continues to be remembered. Not remembered for what it stood for. It stood for internationalism, solidarity, direct action, direct democracy, the cornerstones of a civilised society, free of the divisions and ills of the society we find ourselves in Australia in end of 2024 and the beginning of 2025. So I encourage you, next year, join the Eureka celebrations. Join the Reclaim the Radical Spirit of the Eureka Celebrations group at Ballarat. Join us on that day on the 3rd of December at 4 a.m. at the corner of Eureka and Stall Street in Ballarat, and then follow us during the rest of the day at Bakery Hill, the old Ballarat Cemetery, then Eureka Trades Hall, the Eureka Centre, and finally at the Queen's Head Hotel for a Eureka dinner. See you there on the 171st anniversary celebrations.